So I wanted to share with you an excerpt from this book. You probably can't read it properly, but it's called Killing Hope. U.S. Military and CIA Interventions Since World War II, updated edition. It's by William Bloom, and it has a section in here. It's really great, but it's very informative. But it has a section about Australia and the CIA intervention in Australia, which overthrew the Gough Whitlam government, and he was Democratic Socialist Prime Minister, probably one of the best Prime Ministers, arguably, we've had in Australia. And it's been a neoliberal cluster F since he was ousted with the help of the CIA. So it's actually an interesting excerpt, and I thought I'd share this for those of you who are Australian and don't realise this, and also for the other people, whoever you are, that this is repeated over and over again in many, many countries. And I'll show you that little meme that I like to show, which shows dozens of countries since World War II their countries' governments have been overthrown. And, this is something that happens repeatedly, and it is continuing on. So I'll share this with you now. Thanks for watching. My name is Trish Roberts. Please stay with it. You're watching Faint Signals from Vigo.
When the leader of a communist country was removed from office by the Politburo, this was confirmation to the Western mind of the totalitarian, or at least the arbitrary nature of the communist system. What then are we to make of the fact that in 1975, Edward Gough Whitlam, the legally elected Prime Minister of Australia, was summarily dismissed by a single, non-elected individual, one functioning under the title of, quote, Governor-General, end quote. Whitlam took office in December 1972 as the head of the first Labour Party government in Australia in 23 years. In short order, he set about proving to the opposition parties the correctness of their historical prediction that Labour in power would be, quote, irresponsible and dangerous, end quote, to whom, of course, had always been the question. The war in Vietnam was an immediate example. Australian military personnel serving there under the command of the United States were called home. Conscription was halted, and young men jailed for refusing military service were released. Moreover, the Whitlam government recognized North Vietnam. Several of his ministers publicly denounced the American bombing of Hanoi and called for rallies to oppose it. And protesting dock workers felt inspired to impose a temporary boycott on American shipping, although the last was opposed by Whitlam. Condemnation of President Nixon and his administration, volunteered by Labour ministers, was most undiplomatic. Quote, corrupt, end quote, maniacs, mass murderers, were some of the epithets hurled at Washington. American officials were reported to be, quote, shocked and angered, end quote. The overseas side of Australian intelligence, ASIS by acronym, it turned out was working with the CIA in Chile against the Allende government. Whitlam ordered an immediate halt to the operation in early 1973, although at the time of Allende's downfall in September, ASIS was reportedly still working with the agency. The Labour government showed itself less than committed to the games security people play at home as well. Whitlam let it be known immediately that he did not wish to have his staff members undergo the usual security checks because he knew and trusted them. The Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, was taken aback by such unorthodoxy and informed its CIA colleagues in Australia. Cables went to Washington before long. A political officer at the American Embassy was informing Richard Hall, one of Whitlam's advisers, quote, your Prime Minister has just cut off one of his options, end quote. Hall took the remark to be a threat to cut off intelligence information. Whether bowing to American ASIO pressure or not, Whitlam soon afterward agreed to the security checks. The new administration also put an end to the discrimination against immigrants who were being denied naturalization for having opposed the military juntas in place like Greece and Chile. Most exceptional and alarming to the security professionals was the behaviour of the Attorney General, who showed up unannounced at ASIO headquarters one day in March 1973 with the police and carted away certain files because he suspected that the intelligence agency was withholding information from him. In all likelihood, ASIO was deliberately keeping certain information from its own government, as does every intelligence agency in the world. The difference here, once again, was that Labour government simply refused to accept such a state of affairs as normal. A few years later, after Whitlam's ouster, James Angleton, who had been a high CIA officer in 1973 and directly concerned with intelligence relations with Australia, complained to an Australian television interviewer about, quote, the Attorney General barging in. We were deeply concerned as to the sanctity of this information, which could compromise sources and methods and compromise human life, end quote. The CIA, he said, seriously considered breaking intelligence relations with Australia. As a consequence of Whitlam's unconventional way of running a government, the CIA became rather concerned about the security and continued functioning of its many military and intelligence facilities in Australia. By the agency's standards, it was a highly important setup, employing thousands of persons, a vital part of the early warning system, a key tracking station in the United States global spy satellite system of extremely sophisticated photography and monitoring of activities within the Soviet Union, a U.S. naval communications station which dealt with nuclear submarines, a huge electronics control center set up by the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, to intercept messages of voice, telex, etc., coming in and out of Australia and its Pacific region, that is, eavesdropping on everybody and everything. Most of this had been built in the latter part of the 1960s and was run in such secrecy that not even senior members of the Australian Foreign Ministry had been briefed on exactly what went on in those buildings in Australia's wide open spaces, and the CIA connection was never officially acknowledged. After the Labor Party took power, some of its members voiced strong criticism of these secret facilities. They increasingly demanded an official explanation for their presence and at times even voted for their removal. This was not carried out because the leaders of the Whitlam administration, for all their radical posturing, were not about to leap into political no-man's land by cutting off ties to the West. They spoke of neutralism and non-alignment on occasion, but they were willing to settle for independence, which is all the Papandreous wanted before they were ousted in Greece, another site of an American electronic state within a state in which the host intelligence and defense establishments typically demonstrate more loyalty to the American counterparts than to their own, quote, government of the day, end quote. In 1976, an investigation by the Australian Royal Commission on Intelligence and Security concluded that for many years members of ASIO had been providing the CIA with potentially damaging information about prominent Australian politicians and governmental officials. The information reportedly ranged from accusations of subversive tendencies to details about personal peccadillos. Moreover, it was later learned that in addition to Chile, Australian intelligence had aided US operations in Vietnam, Cambodia and Indonesia. The Whitlam government displayed its independence where it could. In 1973, Whitlam disclosed the existence of an Australian Defence Signals Directorate unit in Singapore, another Cold War toy of the CIA and ASIO, which monitored military and civilian radio traffic in Asia. The DSD is comparable to the American NSA and the British GCHQ. Later, the Australian Prime Minister closed the unit down, although he re-established part of it in Australia. His administration also expressed its disapproval of US plans to build up the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia as another military intelligence nuclear outpost, and in February 1975, the Labor Party conference voted to allow the Provisional Revolutionary Government of Vietnam, the Viet Cong, to set up an office in Australia. This was before the fall of Saigon. Quote, by the end of 1974, end quote, writes Joan Coxedge, a Labor Party member of Parliament in the state of Victoria, almost every move by the Whitlam government or by individual Labor parliamentarians, whether it was a departmental decision, a staff appointment, an international cable, a telex, a phone call, or a confidential letter, quickly became the property of the news media. There was an unparalleled campaign of personal vituperation, hinting at incompetence, dissension, corruption, and private scandal within the ranks of the government. Matters reached the spark point in autumn 1975. Whitlam dismissed the heads of both ASIO and ASIS in separate incidents, the latter because the agency had been secretly assisting the CIA in covert activities in nearby East Timor. Then, at the beginning of November, it was revealed in the press that a former CIA officer, Richard Lee Stallings, had been channeling funds to J. Douglas Anthony, leader of the National Country Party, one of the two main opposition parties. It was reported that Stallings was a close friend and former tenant of Anthony's, That's the secret facilities in the hinterland were indeed CIA creations, and that Stallings had been the first head of much of the operation. A year earlier, an Australian political journalist, Ray Atkinson, had published a book called Looking at the Liberals, the Liberal Party, the other important opposition party, was actually rather conservative, in which he claimed that the CIA had offered the opposition unlimited funds in their unsuccessful attempt to defeat the Labour Party in the May 1974 parliamentary elections. Subsequently, a Sydney newspaper reported that the Liberals had been on the receiving end since the late 1960s and quoted the remarks of former CIA officer Victor Marchetti, who confirmed that the CIA had funded both of the major opposition parties. Whitlam publicly repeated the charges about Stallings and insisted upon an investigation of the facilities to identify once and for all their true nature and purpose. Whether any of it was part of a weapons system was one question which seriously concerned the administration. At the same time, he demanded a list of all CIA operatives in Australia. The Australian military intelligence complex appears to have been spurred into a flurry of activity. On November 6, the head of the Defence Department reportedly met with the Governor-General, Sir John Kerr, and afterward declared publicly, quote, "This is the greatest risk to the nation's security there has ever been," end quote. On the 8th, another senior defence official held a meeting with Kerr in which he briefed the Governor-General about allegations from the CIA that Whitlam was jeopardising the security of the American bases in Australia. The same day, the CIA in Washington informed the ASIO station that all intelligence links with Australia would be cut off unless a satisfactory explanation was given of Mr. Whitlam's behaviour. The agency had already expressed reservations about releasing intelligence information to certain government ministers. If this had been a third world country, the CIA would likely have already sent the government packing. On November 9th, Kerr was received at the Defence Signals Directorate for yet another briefing. The following day, the ASIO station in Washington, at the request of the CIA, sent a telex to its headquarters in Australia, in which it stated that quote, "The CIA cannot see how this dialogue with continued reference to CIA can do other than blow the lid off these installations," end quote. In addition to Stallings, the name of his successors, senior CIA officers, and the CIA station chief in Canberra had appeared in the press. Kerr, who was taken with the world of spookery and regularly saw classified material in all likelihood, was aware of the ASIO telex and the CIA ultimatum. On the 11th, he dismissed Whitlam as Prime Minister, dissolved both Houses of Parliament, and appointed Malcolm Fraser, the leader of the Liberal Party, to head an interim government until new elections could be held on December 13th. In the hours between the appointment of Fraser and the dissolution of Parliament, the Labour majority in the House of Representatives pushed through a no-confidence motion against Fraser, an act which obliged the Governor-General to dismiss the Liberal leader in turn. Kerr chose to ignore this manoeuvre, which was a legalistic one, although his dismissal of Whitlam had no less a legalistic act. On October 15th, the opposition-controlled Senate had refused to vote on a new budget appropriation bill called Supply in Australia, in order to force the government to dissolve Parliament and hold new elections, hoping thus to regain power. Though the Constitution gave the Senate the technical right to withhold approval of the budget, it was seldom interpreted literally as it is in the United States. Precedent was of greater importance, and the fact was that in Australia's 75-year history as a federation, the Senate had never exercised the right against the federal government. Only days earlier, 8 leading law professors had publicly declared such action to be constitutionally improper. The opposition tactic was thus at least debatable. When Whitlam refused to dissolve Parliament and tried to govern without the budget, a constitutional and financial crisis steadily built up over the course of several weeks. Then Kerr invoked a power as archaic and as questionable as that employed by the Senate. It was the first time a Governor-General had ever dismissed a Prime Minister, a federal Prime Minister. It had occurred but once before on a state level. The Melbourne newspaper The Age, which said the New York Times was, quote, generally held to be one of the nation's most responsible papers, end quote, wrote that Kerr's action was, quote, a triumph of narrow legalism over common sense and popular feeling, end quote. It added, By bringing down the government because the Senate refused its supply, Sir John Kerr acted at least against the spirit of the Australian Constitution. Since 1901, it has been a firmly held convention that the Senate should not reject budgets. Sir John had created an awesome precedent that a hostile Senate can bring down a government whenever it denies its supply. Kerr breathed life into a constitutional relic, the right of kings and queens to unilaterally appoint governments. And by the way, recently it was released that John Kerr actually didn't talk to the Queen at the time when he did that, so he didn't even confer with the Queen, which is supposedly what Governor-Generals are supposed to do. The office of Governor-General had traditionally been only that of a figurehead representative of the Queen of England. Kerr's decision, however, appears as a calculated political act. He gave Whitlam no warning or ultimatum before dismissing him, no opportunity to request the dissolution of Parliament, which would have permitted him to remain in office. One must read Kerr's own account of his confrontation with Whitlam to appreciate how he manoeuvred the Prime Minister into stalking out of the Governor-General's office without requesting the dissolution. Kerr claims he refrained from issuing Whitlam an ultimatum because he feared that the Prime Minister would leave and then ask the Queen for his removal as Governor-General. But he fails to explain why he didn't give Whitlam an ultimatum that had to be responded to on the spot. Kerr had been appointed, at least in theory, by the Queen. Ironically, she has done so at Whitlam's recommendation, which he had made against the wishes of his party's left wing. Kerr's action added to Whitlam's reputation as a bad judge of character, a man easily taken in. Certainly, the warning signs were there, for John Kerr had been ultimately involved with CIA fronts for a number of years. In the 1950s, he joined the Australian Association for Cultural Freedom, an organisation spawned by the CIA's Congress for Cultural Freedom, see Western Europe chapter. Kerr became a member of the organisation's executive board in 1957 and also wrote for its magazine Quadrant. One article in 1960 was entitled, quote, "The Struggle Against Communism in the Trade Unions," end quote, a program and tactic, as we have seen, the CIA has consistently accorded a high priority to throughout the world. In 1966, Kerr helped to found Law Asia, an organisation of lawyers in the Far East funded by the Asia Foundation. The foundation was one of the most prominent CIA fronts for over a decade, with offices and representatives in all major capitals of Asia. One of its prime missions, Victor Marchetti has written, was, quote, "to disseminate throughout Asia a negative vision of mainland China, North Vietnam and North Korea," end quote. Kerr became Law Asia's first president, a position he held until 1970. He describes the organisation as, quote, "a non-communist group of Asian lawyers," end quote, which the Asia Foundation supported because, quote, "the rule of law is a good thing, a strong legal profession is a good thing, and talk between lawyers is a good thing," end quote. Quote, "there was a bit of celebration," end quote, in the CIA when Whitlam was dismissed by Kerr, reported Christopher Boyce. Boyce is an American who was working at the time for TRW Systems Incorporated, Los Angeles, in a cryptographic communications center which linked CIA headquarters in Virginia with the agency's satellite surveillance system in Australia. In his position, Boyce was privy to telex communications between the two stations. The CIA, he said, referred to Kerr as, quote, "our man," end quote. Boyce also revealed that the CIA had infiltrated Australian labour unions, had been, quote, "manipulating the leadership," end quote, and had, quote, "suppressed their strikes," end quote, particularly those involving railroads and airports. The last was reportedly because the strikes were holding up deliveries of equipment to the agency's installations. Some unions as well had been in the forefront of opposition to the installations. As matters turned out, Whitlam lost the new election. One other CIA operation in Australia deserves mention. This is the Nugent Hand Merchant Bank of Sydney, truly a CIA bank, founded in 1973 by Frank Nugent, an Australian, and Michael Hand, an American formerly with the Green Berets in Vietnam and with the CIA airline Air America. The bank exhibited phenomenal growth over the next few years. It opened branch offices in Saudi Arabia, Hamburg, Malaysia, Thailand, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, Argentina, Chile, Hawaii, Washington, and Annapolis, Maryland, run by men with backgrounds in the CIA, OSS, Green Berets, and similar specialty areas of banking. Former CIA Director William Colby was one of the bank's attorneys. The Nugent Hand Bank succeeded in expanding the scope of normal banking services. Among the activities it was reportedly involved in were drug trafficking, international arms dealing, links to organised crime, laundering money for President Suharto of Indonesia, unspecified services for President and Mrs. Marcos of the Philippines, assisting the Shah of Iran's family to shift money out of Iran, channeling CIA money into pro-American political parties, and operations in Europe, transferring $2.4 million to the Australian Liberal Party through one of the bank's many associated companies, attempting to blackmail an Australian state minister who was investigating organised crime, in brackets, the CIA opened a Swiss bank account in his name and threatened to leak the information, in brackets, and a host of other socially useful projects. In addition, several mysterious deaths have been connected to the bank, including that of a ranking CIA officer in Maryland, and on 27th of January 1980, Frank Nugent was himself found shot dead in his car. In June, Michael Hann disappeared without a trace. The Nugent Hann Merchant Bank.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen. Because nothing will save the Governor-General. The proclamation which you have just heard read by the Governor-General's official secretary was countersigned Malcolm Fraser. Who will undoubtedly go down in Australian history from Remembrance Day 1975 as Kerr's Kerr.